Hello, everyone. This is Jesse Berst with Smart Grid News, the Internet's oldest and largest smart grid site. I'll be your moderator today, and we're very pleased to present this topic. It's so important and so challenging to get value from our smart grid data, and we just have to get analytics right. We can't fulfill the promise of the smart grid unless and until we unlock the value that's hidden in our data. So we've certainly been talking about that for the last couple of years. Lots of noise, lots of discussion, lots of confusion, but not a lot of traction. A lot of utilities are still spinning their wheels. I'm happy to say there are some exceptions to that, and we've got two of them with us today. Two companies are making great progress on analytics, and they're going to share their lessons learned with us. So let's get going. Here's what we're going to cover, and listen, here's the challenge. A lot of utilities are looking for the be-all and the end-all and the do-all analytics solution, and that's great, but that's a long road. So here's another approach. Start smaller. For instance, start with your meter data. Get some quick wins. Get to know your meter data because, you know, almost anything you're going to do to make use in analytics is probably going to make use of meter data. So get it in shape, start getting value from it, and then when you're ready, expand to an enterprise analytics solution. Now, that's the concept, but the devil's in the details. So let's bring in the experts who can explain it all for us. Now, we've got an all-star panel with us today. We'll hear first from Larsh Johnson of eMeter, a Siemens business, and then from Aaron DeYonkers of eMeter. He'll be followed Bill Bell from CenterPoint Energy, and we'll finish up with Raiford Smith from Duke. So let's start with Larsh Johnson. He's one of the godfathers of the smart grid. Yeah, he and his co-founders at eMeter really helped to invent what we now think of as meter data management. So he certainly knows whereof he speaks, and we're very glad to have him with us. Larsh.
Well, thank you, Jesse. I'm not sure about the Godfather reference, but I'll take that with proper intent. But I think smart grid is certainly going to be value as we put the real smart into the smart grid, which is going to be based on data. It's going to be based on using the data and using the sensing capabilities that are so much a part of smart grid operations. But generally, you know, we're looking to understand how to improve the service quality, looking at voltage and power factor, looking at the reliability, looking at outages and restoration improvements, looking at cost in a number of different ways. Cost as it relates to energy efficiency for customers, cost as it relates to demand response, and of course, integration of renewables is a big factor in many parts of the world and many locations, and then of course network losses, workforce optimization, workforce management, and so forth. All big elements of how do we want to use data in terms of making a real smart grid smart. And as we look at this, we're quickly driving into terabytes of data, and it's something that, you know, is only really in many ways just getting started. You know, we hear discussions about phasor measurements, PMUs, and so forth, and we think about people talking about distribution level micro PMUs and so forth. And so clearly there's a lot of future in terms of growth of data and so forth. Some people would say that the amount of data that's being generated worldwide today is increasing at such a rate that in the last couple of years we've generated more data than all history before it. And I'm not sure how you validate something like that, but I can certainly understand that the amount of data we're generating today is quite a bit more than it has been, and certainly in our industry has been substantially more than we've had even a couple of years ago. And so, you know, looking at sort of the evolution of analytics and how do we want to leverage this data, we're really coming from sort of a state-of-the-art, what happened last month or maybe what happened last week, to moving to why did something happen, and then looking forward to the opportunity to say what should we do about that and be predictive and proactive about it. So clearly this analytics issue is an evolution being driven by a number of factors, but as Jesse pointed out, smart metering, it does tend to be one of those drivers in many utilities today. We see this as a common theme as we look around the globe, actually. And it's driving a lot of utilities to raise issues about what they need to do from an analytics perspective. So looking forward, the scope of this analytics question is certainly quite broad, and we hear it talked about in the context of IT and OT, working across many different silos within the utility. And this naturally leads to thoughts of a large enterprise solutions, enterprise data warehouses, and massive programs to look at data ingestion from all parts of the organization in many different types of systems. Clearly, that's an important future state and a direction, but it raises a bunch of questions about how do we get there and what some of the impediments are. And a recent study basically identified some of the leading issues of barriers to implementing large-scale utility analytics. And probably not surprisingly, one of the first items on the list was the lack of trained personnel. And in this case, I think it's not just those personnel that are experienced in the technology of large data, big data analytics, or even machine learning technologies and so forth, but it's also the subject matter experts within the utility who understand the business processes, and both the number of those folks, but also their availability to work on something that may be outside their normal job scope. And then taking on the technology issues, the availability of hardware and software to support such a large-scale analytics project is also another key impediment. In the end, I think this comes back down to what the last two items on this list, and that is budget. All right, how do we fund some of this? And of course, budget's driven by priorities. So it's interesting to note here that the priority of needs is ranked quite low, indicating that most utilities certainly feel this is a high priority item. On the other hand, the budget constraints are also a significant issue. So I think this sort of leads us to think about how do we take on a project and how do we look to advance the cause. I think, and this is where the idea of starting small and working towards some quick wins, I think, really makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Larsh. This is Jesse Berst with Smart Grid News, and we're talking about data analytics, and we just heard from Larsh Johnson of eMeter. He'll be standing by throughout the whole session to join in on our Q&A sections. But before our first set of questions, we want to talk a little bit about the benefits of starting small, and for that, let's bring on Aaron DeYonkers from eMeter. He manages eMeter's entire product portfolio, so he's truly got a global perspective, both literally in terms of geography, but figuratively in terms of the scope of his understanding. Aaron, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jesse. I love the Godfather reference. I guess if Larsh is the Godfather, then I'm the Michael Corleone to his Marlon Brando character there for all the cinephiles out there. So I think the landscape can be pretty overwhelming right now with all of the technology vendors out there and all the promises that are out there. And it can be, overwhelming to the IT directors or the CIOs trying to figure out what the right next steps are. I sort of sit between the customers at the utility side and these technology vendors, and I'm starting to see a pattern emerge here. The ones that really go out swinging for the fences have some fits and starts to their plan. And the ones that try to peel off very specific problems to solve and narrow them down early on and execute against those seem to have some traction that help inform the next phases in where they're going with the analytics roadmaps that they have. And I really want to shorten my presentation here so we can move over to some of those examples, especially with CenterPoint and with Duke. So we all know that we need to get to a point where we've got stable integration platforms, and we all know that there's going to be very, very sophisticated models and algorithms that we're going to apply to these expansive data sets. And then we also know that there's going to be extensive upheaval within the utility organization. Again, just taking a step back and looking at that problem set, it can almost be paralyzing thinking about what needs to be done, especially in cultures which by design are meant to be pretty stable organizations. I think the main thing is that the way you're going to get there is by starting small, learning, and then iterating on those examples as you move forward. And one thing that I've noticed in sitting between the technology vendors and the utility customer is that it's really important to decouple the huge technology decisions from getting started on some of these analytics problems. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to investigate some limited use cases by doing stuff in the cloud and starting to get your feet wet, and then pushing off those really, really big decisions around long-term architectures and technology decisions, really feeling comfortable with decoupling that from getting started with the true analytics processing has been something that has been quite successful, I think, with folks out there in the market. And then I really want to emphasize as well is that you want to get to a point where you're unearthing a lot of the data integrity problems you have with the organization. So like Jesse said, focusing on the meter data first and starting to expand from there and integrating other data sets. As you start plugging that data together, you'll start seeing points where there's gaps organizationally. And I think the point is, I've been in multiple industries, from telecommunications, from satellite and cable systems. Every industry has gone through this, so it's perfectly normal when you hook everything up for the first time that there's a year's worth of work to clean it up. So I think starting small and hitting some low-hanging fruit allows you to identify where those areas are and prioritize them, but also still move forward on getting some answers to some questions that you have for the organization. And going off of what Jesse and Larsh have said, we know one thing. One thing is that things are changing. And the other thing is that we know we have data now to help us, guide us in understanding what those changes are. And here's just a really good slide to show what a typical load profile was for a transformer in 2003 versus what it ended up being in 2011 with the introduction of renewables. So that, I think, is just a perfect metaphor for the change in the industry and how far things have changed. That load profile in 2003 was probably the same load profile that existed for decades. And then just in this brief span of time, the variance in that load profile and then our ability to capture it and show it to the organization has accelerated tremendously. So then the ways that we need to look at our technologies that we've implemented, the ones that we've been using for a century, need to be different. So looking at a transformer and looking at its nameplate rating and just from the specs, understanding how long that transformer is supposed to live, it's a whole different ballgame now that things are changing. And the ability to take analytics and really look at the true utilization of assets on the grid and apply these algorithms to see what is the actual aging of your systems is just a very clear example of some of the benefits that can be reaped by starting small and doing some focused use cases. So just wanted to point that out, and I really wanted to get out of the way. So I'm really excited to have Bill show some of the examples that CenterPoint has had.
Thank you, Aaron. Listen, we're here today talking about why and how to start small in big data. We just heard from Aaron DeYonkers of eMeter. I'm Jesse Berst from Smart Grid News, and we're going to take a few questions now.